The check cleared at 9:37 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I was sitting in the parking lot of the TD branch on Yonge Street watching the notification appear on my phone, and I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there in my car with the engine running and thought, he has no idea what he just did. Let me back up. My mother, Catherine, died on a Saturday in November. She had been sick for 14 months. Ovarian cancer, stage 3 when they caught it, stage 4 by the time the treatment stopped working. I had moved back to Toronto from Vancouver the moment she got the diagnosis, sleeping in my old bedroom with the faded purple walls and the window that never closed all the way. I gave up my apartment, my job at the marketing firm, 2 years of building something that felt like a life. I did not hesitate for a single day. She was my mother. My stepfather, Richard, had been in the picture since I was 11. He was not a bad man in the obvious ways. He never raised his hand, never screamed, never disappeared. But he was the kind of man who kept a very careful mental spreadsheet of what he was owed. And he had been married to my mother for 17 years. And somewhere in those 17 years, he had convinced himself that the house on Birchwood Crescent, the one my mother bought with her own savings before she ever met him, the one her parents helped her with the down payment on, was simply going to be his. My mother had other thoughts about that. I did not know this until after she died. That is the part I keep coming back to, how quietly she'd been protecting me, and how I had no idea. Her name was on the title alone. That had always been the case. Richard's name was never added, and my mother, who was a meticulous woman, a woman who color-coded her filing cabinet and renewed her will every 5 years, had updated that will 8 months before she died. I found this out from Marcus, her estate lawyer, whom she had instructed to contact me directly upon her passing. Not Richard, me. But I am getting ahead of myself. The day my mother died, Richard did not grieve the way I expected a husband to grieve. He was quiet, yes, and he looked tired, and he accepted the casseroles the neighbors brought over with a kind of mechanical politeness. But within 48 hours, he was on the phone in the kitchen, and I could hear fragments through the wall, words like appraiser and market value and spring listing. I told myself I was misreading it. People cope in strange ways. Maybe he was talking about something else. Maybe I was projecting. Then, on the 4th day after the funeral, he sat me down at the kitchen table where I had eaten 10,000 breakfasts and told me, with a kind of careful reasonableness that I now recognize as rehearsed, that he would need me to find alternate accommodation within 30 days. The house was going to be listed. He had already spoken to a realtor. He was very sorry, he said, but it was simply too large for one person, and he needed to move forward. I looked at him across the table where my mother's reading glasses still sat beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. I said, okay. I said, I understand. I did not say anything else. I called Marcus the next morning. What he told me rearranged everything. My mother had left the house in a trust. Not to Richard, not to me, outright. In a trust structured specifically so that I would become the sole beneficiary upon her death, with the provision that it could not be sold or transferred without my written consent and the approval of the trustee, which was Marcus himself. She had also left me her TFSA, just over $112,000, and a separate savings account that Richard did not know existed, opened in her maiden name at a credit union in Etobicoke. She had known for years what Richard was, and she had quietly, methodically built a wall around everything that mattered. Marcus also told me something else. He said that Richard had already called him. Twice. The first call was 2 days after my mother's funeral, asking about the timeline for probate and whether the house could be listed before the estate was settled. The second call was 4 days later, at which point Richard had apparently informed Marcus that he intended to challenge the will on grounds of undue influence, the suggestion being that I, the grieving daughter, had somehow manipulated a woman with terminal cancer into cutting her husband out of the estate. Marcus's voice was very dry when he told me this. He said, I want you to understand your position clearly. Then he explained it to me. I want to be honest. I was frightened. Not of Richard exactly, but of the machinery of it. Lawyers, courts, the idea of spending the money my mother had left me fighting over the money my mother had left me. I called my aunt in Hamilton, my mother's older sister Patricia, and I cried for about an hour on the phone. Then I wiped my face and I made a decision. I was not going to confront Richard. I was not going to warn him. I was not going to give him any indication of what I knew or what I was prepared to do. I was going to let him believe he was winning. This turned out to be the right call. Over the next 6 weeks, while I stayed with Patricia in Hamilton and drove back to Toronto twice a week to collect my things slowly in small boxes so Richard would not notice I was preparing, I had Marcus begin the formal probate process. What emerged during that process was something none of us had anticipated. Marcus had flagged an irregularity in my mother's bank account, her personal checking account, the one she and Richard held jointly. In the 11 months between her diagnosis and her death, there had been a series of withdrawals that did not match her spending patterns, amounts between $800 and $30,500 withdrawn at ATMs and transferred to an account that was not linked to any of her known finances, 31 transactions in 11 months. The total was just over $67,000. My mother had been too sick to manage her own banking in the last 4 months of her life. I had been managing it for her, but the withdrawals had started before that, in the months when she was still mobile, still present, still sitting at that kitchen table doing crosswords. She would not have done this herself. She was saving that money for me. She would have told me. Marcus contacted a forensic accountant. The forensic accountant contacted the estate's bank fraud department. The fraud department, after reviewing the transaction records, contacted the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. I did not know any of this was in motion when Richard called me on a Thursday afternoon in February and told me he had found a buyer for the house. Firm offer, he said. $1.4 million. Closing in 30 days. He would need me to sign a release acknowledging I had no claim on the property. I said, that sounds like a significant step. I said, I'll have to think about it. He said, there's nothing to think about. The house is mine. I said, I hear you, and I hung up. I called Marcus immediately. He was already aware. The listing had appeared on MLS 3 weeks earlier. Marcus had set a Google alert for the address the moment Richard had mentioned it in that second phone call. Marcus had already filed a certificate of pending litigation against the title, which meant that any real estate lawyer doing a title search on the property would see a flag. A legitimate closing could not proceed without that being resolved. But Richard had apparently not done a thorough title search before accepting the offer. Or rather, his agent had flagged it, and Richard had told the agent he would handle it, and then he had not handled it because he believed that the certificate was a bluff that would dissolve once I realized I had no legal standing. This is what Marcus believed, based on a letter Richard's lawyer sent in early March, which was dismissive in tone and inaccurate in its characterization of the trust documents. The closing was scheduled for a Monday. A boardroom in a real estate law office on Bay Street. 10 a.m. Marcus called me the Friday before. He said, I think you should be there. I said, I'll be there. I want to tell you what it felt like to walk into that room, because I think about it often. I had dressed carefully, not to impress, but because my mother always said that how you carry yourself in a difficult room is the first thing people read before you say a word. I wore a gray blazer she had given me 2 birthdays ago. I had her pearl earrings in. I was 28 minutes early. Richard arrived at 9:52. He walked in with his real estate agent and his lawyer, and for a moment he did not see me because I was sitting at the far end of the table with Marcus and a woman from the fraud unit whom I will call Detective Sergeant Okafor, because that is her name and she agreed I could use it. Richard was talking to his agent about parking. He was wearing a new coat. He looked like a man who believed he was about to receive $1.4 million. Then he saw me. I will not pretend I felt nothing. I felt something, but I kept my face still. The buyer's lawyer opened the meeting. He had received documentation that morning. Marcus had sent it over at 7 a.m., and he was already visibly uncomfortable. He said there appeared to be a dispute regarding the title that needed to be resolved before any transfer could occur. Richard's lawyer began to speak. Marcus interrupted, quietly, and laid a folder on the table. Inside the folder was a copy of the trust document, certified by the Law Society of Ontario. Inside the folder was a transaction history of 31 withdrawals with IP addresses, ATM locations, and timestamps. Inside the folder was a report from the forensic accountant concluding that the pattern of withdrawals was consistent with financial abuse of a vulnerable adult. And inside the folder was a document I had not known about until 2 days prior. A printout of an email Richard had sent to his girlfriend, whose name I will not use here, in which he described the house as his retirement plan and referred to my mother's estate as finally coming through. The email was dated 6 weeks before my mother died. Richard's lawyer asked for a recess. Richard did not move. He was looking at the table. Detective Sergeant Okafor stood up and introduced herself. There's a version of this where I describe exactly what happened next in cinematic detail, every word and gesture, but the honest version is simpler. Richard was informed that he was the subject of an ongoing investigation into elder financial abuse under Section 331 of the Criminal Code of Canada, that the funds he had transferred totaled $67,400, and that the certificate of pending litigation would remain on the title until the estate matter was fully resolved. The buyer's lawyer excused himself and his clients from the room. The closing did not happen. Richard left without speaking to me. I sat in that boardroom for another 40 minutes with Marcus and Detective Okafor and the particular quiet that comes after something enormous has shifted. Marcus had coffee brought in. I drank mine and looked out at the gray February sky over Bay Street and thought about my mother sitting in her oncologist's office, still going over financial documents, still making sure the lock was on the door. The trust was formally settled in April. The house on Birchwood Crescent is mine. I am not living in it yet. I rented it out while the criminal matter is still proceeding, which Marcus advised, and I went back to Vancouver for a few months because I needed to breathe air that did not carry 14 months of grief in it. But it is mine. The title is clear. Her name is off it now, and my name is on it, and that is the thing she wanted, and I am going to take care of it the way she took care of everything. Richard has retained a criminal defense lawyer. I am not permitted to discuss the specifics of the ongoing investigation. What I can tell you is that financial abuse of a vulnerable person carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in Canada, and that the Crown takes elder financial abuse seriously, and that the $67,400 has been flagged as part of the estate assets to be recovered. I did not scream. Not once. Not in the parking lot of the TD branch when the check cleared into an account that should have been frozen. Not at the kitchen table when he told me to leave. Not in that boardroom when he finally understood what had happened to him. My mother did not raise a screaming woman. She raised a patient one. She raised someone who understood that the most devastating thing you can do to a person who thinks they have outmaneuvered you is simply to show up. The last thing she said to me, the actual last thing, in the hospital room at 2 a.m., with the November rain against the window, was that she was sorry she couldn't make it simpler. I told her she had made it perfect. I didn't fully understand what I meant by that until April, when Marcus handed me the keys and I stood on the front step of the house on Birchwood Crescent and put my hand on the door she had painted red the summer I turned 16. She had been playing chess for years. I just had to stay on the board long enough to see the end of the game. If there is something I want you to take from this, and I have thought about whether it is my place to say it, it is this. Document everything, every transaction, every conversation, every decision you make on behalf of someone you love who is sick, not because you expect to need it, because the person who wants to take advantage of that situation is counting on the fact that you are too exhausted and too heartbroken to keep records. Do not give them that. Keep the records. Know what was signed and when and by whom. Understand what a certificate of pending litigation is before you need one. My mother knew all of this. She spent the last healthy months of her life making sure the paper trail was airtight, and that paper trail is the reason I am sitting in my car outside a house with a red door instead of fighting a losing battle in probate court. I am going to repaint the front door this spring, same color. She picked it out of a magazine, and I remember her holding the swatch up against the brick and laughing because it was too bold. It was completely too bold. And then she painted it anyway. Some things you keep exactly as they were. Some things you just need to be patient enough to get back. There is a version of this story where I lose, where I am too tired, too sad, too overwhelmed by grief to read a document carefully or ask a second question or pick up the phone one more time. I came close to that version. There were nights at my aunt's house in Hamilton where I genuinely could not remember why any of it mattered, where the house felt like just a house, where I thought maybe letting Richard have it would simply be the easier thing. But I had watched my mother fight for 14 months without once pretending the situation was something other than what it was. She did not soften the diagnosis to make herself feel better. She did not avoid the hard conversations with her lawyer because they were uncomfortable. She sat down while she was still well enough to sit, and she made decisions and signed documents and thought carefully about what she was leaving behind and for whom. That kind of clarity is not passive. It is a choice made over and over to see things as they are and respond with your full intelligence rather than your fear. What Richard understood about me was that I was grieving. What he did not understand was that grief and clarity are not opposites. Sometimes the people who have lost the most are the ones paying the closest attention because they know exactly what is worth protecting. The $67,400 he took did not disappear because the universe corrected itself. It surfaced because Marcus was meticulous, because the forensic accountant knew what patterns to look for, because Detective Okafor's unit takes financial abuse seriously, and because my mother had quietly made sure that every account, every document, every transaction was traceable. Actions leave records. Choices accumulate into evidence. Richard had been making small decisions for years that each seemed, individually, manageable. One withdrawal, one phone call to a realtor, and each one of those decisions built the case against him brick by brick. He constructed his own consequences without realizing it, because he assumed no one was watching and no one would look. That is the thing about integrity operating quietly in the background. My mother did not make those financial decisions to trap Richard. She made them because she was a careful woman who loved her daughter and understood that love sometimes looks like a properly structured trust document. The trap was not set. The trap was simply what responsible, ethical choices look like when someone tries to run straight through them. I think about the person I might have been if I had confronted Richard at that kitchen table. If I had screamed, accused, threatened, made the whole thing loud and immediate and emotional. I would have given him information he could use. I would have given him time to move money, alter records, prepare. Patience was not passivity. It was strategy, and the discipline to hold it even when everything in me wanted to react. What I carry forward from this is not bitterness toward Richard. It is something closer to a commitment, to pay attention, to keep records, to ask the second question, to not assume that someone else is handling things that matter to me. My mother modeled that her entire life. She was not lucky. She was prepared. The red door is still there. I am going to keep it exactly that color.